welcome to everyone who has joined us today. I'm really glad to have you. My name is Rose Hendricks, and I'm a Kavli-funded Civic Science Fellow. And I'm here representing the Society Civic Science Initiative, which is a collaborative effort among scientific and professional societies and associations to work together to support scientists who engage with members of the public, communities, and decision makers, and to figure out ways that together we can be even more supportive than societies already are individually. So, we call this a civic science initiative, and civic science tends to be a newer topic or a newer term for a lot of us, but the topic is more familiar. And what we mean by this is really just any intersection between science and the broader society. So as you can imagine, the COVID-19 crisis is really kind of a quintessential civic science issue, and one that brings home the importance of strong relationships between science and society. So we'll open in just 1 minute with introducing each of our panelists. But first I wanted to open the floor to all of you to share a little bit about who you are. So I've set up this poll. Please feel free to respond either in your browser. You can see by going to pollev.com and then typing in the username, or by texting the username to 22333 to let us know your primary area of research or study. And this will give us a better sense of who all is on this call and the diverse fields we represent. So feel free to do that. And while you're doing it, I also wanted to make a note that one of the key points of value that we see in this Society Civic Science Initiative is that we are very transdisciplinary. So we represent really all of the fields of science and engineering, including social sciences and computer sciences, of course, all of the ones you see here. And that's for a couple reasons. One being that many of our real world problems don't fit very nicely in disciplinary boxes, right? Even the COVID crisis, which is a virus, and that's the field of study for a lot of researchers, actually has implications for so many of our fields. And so we can kind of better attack real world problems together. And then also because when it comes to engagement with issues in society and with different audiences, there are so many things we can learn from each other, given that the experience for a chemist is maybe not that different than the experience for a political scientist, for example, when it comes to really effective engagement. So great, I see we've got a shifting group, but a pretty diverse one. There are certainly a couple of fields that we could have done a little more to recruit from, it seems, but that's okay too. Feel free to keep jumping in with this, but I've got one more question for you all, and this one you can weigh in the chat, which is to share with us what society or societies you've been involved in. So these can be any kinds of associations or professional organizations that you've maybe attended their annual meeting or are a member of and participate in programs with. Maybe you've published in their journals, or you just receive their social media or listserv updates. So you can just type this in the chat to give us a sense of, what organizations you're familiar with. If you work for any societies, we'd love to hear that as well, as I know we have a number of staff on this webinar. Excellent. So I see kind of a range pouring in. Great. So please keep adding and letting us know what societies you're affiliated with or have experiences with. But I'd like to get to the meat now, which is, of course, the 4 spectacular panelists we have here. So I'll ask you each, if you don't mind, to just introduce yourself and let us know a little bit about your scientific background and expertise, and then also how you've been addressing COVID so far and any top of mind thoughts you have there. So maybe we'll go in alphabetical order for now, if you don't mind. And Piper, we'll start with you.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here today. My name is Piper Bilo. I am an associate professor of medicine at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. I'm a computational human geneticist, which means that I don't do anything at the wet bench. There are no test tubes in my labs, only computers. And so we work to uncover the genetic basis of complex human diseases. We primarily focus on the approach, the methodologies, the statistical background to these analyses. And so it's been very exciting because we're a lab that both is able to work from home. So we have been able to be productive even in our shelter in place. And we also are a lab that's able to sort of pivot quickly from trait to trait. So we're part of the host COVID genetics COVID-19 Host Genetics Consortium or initiative, which is being led out of the Broad, which is a group of investigators. I think there's about 200 investigators that have already signed on with access to data from COVID, both retrospective and prospective. And so my group is participating in the genetic analysis for that. We also have been working within the biobank that we have here at Vanderbilt University to start to look at infectious disease risk and outcomes for traits like pneumonia and influenza that we actually already have data on and can, before the COVID genetic samples become available, can start launching into really quickly. So that's my sort of professor hat and what we're doing to quickly pivot in the COVID-19 era. Putting on my hobby hat, I also am the head moderator of R Science on reddit.com. And there we're really focused on large scale, truly global science communication. We have about 24 million subscribed readers of our forum today, and we host discussions where we bring in global experts on a particular topic and have them interact directly one-on-one with our lay readers. So since COVID has happened, we've already hosted two big discussions around COVID research and COVID risk. And I'm going to be continuing the effort to bring in top COVID researchers across the spectrum, from epidemiology to virology to genetics. Wherever science is touching on COVID, we're going to be trying to bring in the researchers leading those efforts to explain their work directly to lay audiences. So that's sort of the two sides of where I've been engaging really strongly with COVID so far.
Great, thank you. And then John, maybe we can call on you next to share a bit about your background in response to COVID as well.
Oh, well, that was a little bit hard to follow up on. So I'm John Drazen. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the Human Motion Lab at the University of Pennsylvania. So I'm my doctorate's in biomedical engineering, and pretty much at the start of the COVID crisis, I kind of felt like I feel when there's a medical emergency on a plane, where you hear someone go over the cockpit and say, "Hey, there's an emergency. The pilot would like a doctor to come to the front." At which point my wife kicks me and says, "Not you." So I'm a biomechanist. So what I do is I study how people move and then how they get injured and how they recover and how we can best treat people. And I've been a postdoc for the past 2 years at Penn. And so the big thing is I also do a lot of STEM education work. So I know Paul DeVita's here, so a big shout out to him with National Biomechanics Day. That's a really cool outreach initiative where pretty much thousands of kids are introduced to science every year through biomechanics. But for the past 8 years, I've been STEM director of Fourth Family Incorporated, which is a grassroots nonprofit where I get kids into math and science through sports performance training. So I've had a lot of success in those domains, and at this point I actually lead all STEM outreach efforts at the NBA Summer League at Las Vegas. So when the COVID crisis hit, I was kind of like, okay, I really can't do anything, but then the NBA season was canceled on March 11th. And what I realized was that I'm one of the few scientists who have a foot in both professional sports and science, and I can act as a bridge between those two different domains. I was also really fortunate in that a month and a half ago, I received the AAAS Early Career Award for Public Engagement. So I was just hanging out with the AAAS a month ago. So what I did is I reached out to Liz Crocker and Emily Cloyd at the AAAS, and I pitched them the project. So for the past month, I've been coordinating between really expert COVID researchers and sports media platforms, trying to get sports fans exposed to COVID science and experts. Because one of the biggest things that I do with my STEM outreach work is I meet the kids where they're at. Something I've observed anecdotally, and I've been doing a lot of research on it as a researcher, is that the kids who sign up for robotics clubs are often like, I really like science and I feel like there's a space for me here. And that's great. But what it's really doing is it's retaining a lot of those students rather than expanding the pipeline. So with all my STEM outreach work, what I do is I broaden the pipeline by making basketball a venue for STEM engagement. And as I was watching a bunch of comments on sports blogs and everything like that, I realized that a lot of the people who were talking and commenting were not going on bar science. So I wanted to be able to bring those discussions into new arenas. And it's been going really well, but I'm in awe of all the work that Dr. Bello is doing.
Fantastic. Thank you, John. Maybe Farah, would you mind sharing next a bit about your background and your COVID response?
Sure. So my name's Farah. I'm a graduate student at the University of Toronto, so I'm up in Canada. I carry out DNA sequencing to better understand complex neurological disorders. Specifically, I'm working with cohorts of individuals with epilepsies, autism spectrum disorder, and ataxia. When I'm not in the lab, I usually enjoy writing stories about science and scientists, and I enjoy taking part at kind of the science policy interface through a student group I co-founded called the Toronto Science Policy Network. Now, for me, the response to COVID-19, so I think for the first few days, I was just watching the news roll in and just scrolling through social media and just saying, okay, the number of cases keeps rising, there's a number of deaths, and it's just, I think I was just spent a few days kind of just scrolling through the depths of social media, just trying to get acclimatized to the new reality. And for me, kind of as I learned about social distancing and flattening the curve, I realized that I wanted to do something, I just wasn't sure what. And then I slowly kind of realized three things. The first was I kind of noticed there were a lot of grassroots initiatives, at least in Canada, and I know in the US, popping up. There were so many drives to get PPE, to get reagents, to get resources. So I actually ended up volunteering with a group of Canadian researchers to build a one-stop portal. So it's called the COVID-19 Resources Canada Group. We've kind of crowdsourced all the different Canadian initiatives around COVID-19 to be in one site so that people can kind of access it and find it easily. The second thing I noticed was there was a lot of confusion around things like social distancing, flattening curve, how scientists can get involved. So I put on my reporter hat and I started writing more about COVID-19, but kind of addressing the questions that people have. So one of the things that I wrote was what are 10 ways scientists can get involved? Another one was, can COVID-19 can kind of be transmitted through tears, so like crying? The answer is there's a low risk right now. And the third thing that I noticed was, especially because I'm a graduate student, I noticed there wasn't as much information going around about what's happening to trainees. How is COVID-19 impacting graduate students? Are we still going to graduate? What happens to our funding? What happens next? These are a lot of questions. So for me, I couldn't find a lot of those answers. What I ended up doing was collaborating with my student group, so the Toronto Science Policy Network, and we're building a survey to actually survey graduate students across Canada to see what the impact of COVID-19 is on their graduate students. So yeah, for me, it's kind of been first shock, and then this is how I can get involved, and now I'm going to do something.
That's amazing. And it'd be really fascinating to hear some of the results once you learn of them more. And Devon, who has graciously agreed to fill in for Artie Garg, who is not well today. So Devon, we're especially grateful to you. Will you share a bit about your background and your
Sure. Well, let me, I'm going to share, today I'll be sharing what Artie wanted to share, and then I'll also share a bit about me. So if you don't know Artie is the founder of an organization called ESAL, which stands for Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally. And I know her because we were both AAAS fellows. and because I am now on the side, I write articles for her for ESAL. So it's one of the ways that I'm finding to make a contribution. So yeah, Artie's not feeling well, ironically, in this COVID time. She's sheltered at home with her kids, and just in the last hour, she asked if I could step up. So I'm going to do my best to represent some of the things she would have liked to say. She is a physicist and aerospace engineer, and she works in AI solution development, but then really has spearheaded this incredible policy work that I mentioned, which is very much focused on local policy. So if you look at ESAL's website at some point, it includes information for how scientists can get locally engaged, civically engaged, running for local office, or taking on other types of roles. It has a bunch of blogs about how scientists have done that successfully without compromising, and actually make that additive for their careers. And she recently has put up a whole COVID-19 resources page that is on ESAL. So that's her role. I'm a freshwater turtle ecologist, and then I was a AAAS fellow working on turtle ecology and general watershed ecology around the world. And I now have maybe 20, if not 30 years, I've lost count, of being in science communication for the Natural History Museum in DC and some other outlets. And I am sheltered at home with 3 teenagers, one of whom had to flee college in London. So I feel a little guilty because my role, I had in the last year decided to go fully remote with my career. I'm in my 50s, and I thought, well, if I go fully remote, I can do this till I'm 90. And I got kind of excited about the agility that I can go around the world writing. And so I had already gone entirely digital. And so in an odd way, nothing for me has changed, except that the rest of my family is now in the house too. And so, yeah, I felt a little guilty, like it should have more of an impact. And so I have been starting to really focus some of my writing on COVID issues and on how other people and how scientists are coping and getting involved with COVID. So I'll share some of that today.
Thank you so much. And I especially appreciate kind of the point that there are a lot of emotions that can come up in this time. And, guilt is just one of many of them. So yes, I appreciate that. And I wanted to ask a sort of general question that if you can respond to, just kind of, do you think that scientists, really regardless of their background, bring to the COVID-19 response in terms of resources or skills or mindsets that really most or all researchers would have that equip them to respond?
So one of my favorite things about organizing the stuff that I've been doing is how much scientists say I don't know, and being very cautious with declarative statements. So it's been very interesting, because one of the things that I've been doing is I actually have a tag team approach to all the podcasts that we're producing, where we have a sports epidemiologist by the name of Zach Binney, who's doing an absolutely excellent job, who's an expert in public health, but he looks at sports injuries. And looking at injury epidemiology in the NFL, and he can talk a lot about epidemiological models, but he always says, I am not an infectious disease expert, so I will not do these hits on my own. And then when I talk to an infectious disease person, they say, I'm not in vaccine development, so I can't talk about this. But scientists are really good at serving as kind of ambassadors for the way that we find new things, because science isn't a body of facts. Science is a process to learn new things. And in times like this, kind of understanding the method of science is a lot more important than whether or not a specific treatment works based on one study. And scientists will say, this is promising, however, we need to learn more. And I think that that's something that's very important to communicate in these times, because pretty much the entire population is watching pretty much warp speed science in real time. So having people from a bunch of different domains speak to that within the context of their own experience will hopefully make it so that the public is more patient and aware of this is why we know what we know.
And echoing John's points, I think all scientists do have certain skills that they can leverage for the COVID-19 response. So we've all been trained to think critically, to gather data, to interpret findings. You may not be the expert, but you are like a trusted voice in your network who can break down these concepts and be that trusted ambassador in helping explain information, explain the logic behind what public health authorities may be saying, especially when it comes to debunking misinformation. People who know you are more likely to trust you rather than listening to facts from a trusted authority, but an authority that they may not know as well.
I've been fascinated in interviewing scientists over the last couple of years who are in elected office. Time and time again, every one of them says, I went in not realizing how much my skills would be put into play because I thought they weren't that relevant, whether you're a biochemical engineer or something else. And that, as both of you have said, John and Farah, there's this whole evidence-based approach and inquiry-driven approach that comes to play in any problem-solving scenario. So I think that that's something for all of us to remember right now about trying to get more engaged in areas that are new to us and that feel unfamiliar. And I thought it was great when this morning I was interviewing the Wyoming Senate Minority Leader, whose name is Chris Rothfuss, and I just loved what he's in his third term as the minority leader, and it was just fascinating to hear, him say, which I've heard again and again, that we need scientists to jump in with both feet because that's what other people are doing, but without that, bringing that scientific expertise and to really just not hold back.
Add anything, Piper?
Sure. I echo everything that everyone has said so far. I think that it's brilliant for scientists to use our education and our background to help vet information for the general public. What's a trusted source, what's not a trusted source, and also to try to improve the accessibility of material that would otherwise be fairly inaccessible. Right now, all the scientific research sort of passes through the filter of popular media on its way to the general public. And the more we can do to bring down that wall and put the scientists and their method of thinking and their explanations to the scientific approach, which is something that is across all fields within science, it's not COVID specific, and bring that to the forefront and engage directly within the sort of at-risk, informationally at-risk communities, I think would be one way to put it, is a huge endeavor and something that will be of tremendous value in this particular time. And I also, another way of sort of thinking of that is that every time scientists come forward and sort of have each other's back about what the scientific process is and what its weaknesses are and what the nuances are, we sort of create a little bit of a human shield around the individuals that are sticking their necks up as the face of any particular finding or study, which is a pretty high risk position for them to put themselves into. And when we sort of envelop each other and present ourselves as not necessarily a force that's in agreement, because obviously all we do is really disagree with each other, right? But as in defense of the scientific process, I think that we can really serve a big purpose to help sway the public's experience as they're engaging in what you say, like sort of rapid fire science at the speed of light that we're all experiencing right now.
Yeah, thank you. And before I jump into my next question, I wanted to make sure attendees know, please feel free to add comments right in the chat, and we'll try to address them as we can. But something that I think we've already alluded to a couple of times is really the warp speed, or how rapidly things are unfolding right now. And I'm often reflecting on the fact that when things move really quickly, for example, if we're making policy proposals or executing crisis communications, we sometimes lose sight of the importance of equity and inclusion. And I'm curious if you have thoughts as to how we can make sure that we're really prioritizing equity and inclusion in our responses to COVID, especially when we've seen that it's clearly exacerbating the inequities that we already have in our society. So if there are any strategies or channels or actions that you think provide opportunities to really improve equity and make sure that we don't, in our haste, sort of make inequities more problematic. John, I might start with you if you don't mind, since you were the first to bring up the warp speed point.
Yeah, I mean, so once again, full disclosure, I just read Demon Haunted World by Carl Sagan a few months ago, and it was extraordinarily influential on kind of my thoughts towards science communication. I've been doing it very, not informally, but I didn't realize how amazing that book was until I read it. And one of the biggest things that he talks about is differentiating between facts or scientific truths, as close as we can get to, and pseudoscience. And the difference between those two things are the fact that, as Dr. Bello was just talking about, that scientists argue with each other all the time. And one of my favorite things is seeing like preprints hashed out on Twitter by like 3 or 4 very reputable epidemiologists, like that Santa Clara study that just came out. Like, everybody just pointed out like all of these different issues with regards to like subject recruitment, reporting different like sampling methods, etc. And it was like watching peer review in real time, which is very, very cool. So with regards to the equity and inclusion piece, I will talk to what I know. And one of the biggest things is just making it so that information is accessible on a number of different platforms. So I think one of the coolest things that's come out of the crisis, and obviously it's terrible, but the fact that Steph Curry has created a COVID-19 fact page. I had nothing to do with it, but one of the things is that you're able to see that he's accessing a whole different swath of the population with his platform, reach, and network. So even when Dr. Fauci went on to the Barstool podcast, once again, that's reaching into a whole nother population of people. And just I'll end with like, once again, the most important thing is that we need to communicate the process of science rather than the facts that it produces, because in this rapid fire world, like if you take masks, for example, like that entire, like we didn't know how this thing transmitted when a lot of these guidelines were being developed, and finding ways to communicate that changing guidelines that isn't malfeasance, that's better science. So communicating that to as wide of a population as possible is crucial.
I'm going to jump in now. I think speed is important in a time like this, but I also recommend slowing down and kind of taking a minute to think things through before you jump in. For example, I wanted to see the impact of COVID-19 on graduate students, but I made sure to slow down and actually consult with different stakeholders. For example, what are the concerns that international students have? What are the concerns that students with families may have, or students who may not be able to travel home? So taking the time to consult with different stakeholders before you kind of roll out your science communication is important. Another example, goes to actually science writers and reporters. So if you're reporting on COVID-19, are you using sources from a variety of expertise or backgrounds? And what terms and language are you using around COVID-19? So there have been like a lot of war metaphors and war analogies around COVID-19. Is that really the best way we want to frame this issue? So these are kind of the things that you kind of want to keep in mind as you're doing science communication. And there are a lot of best practices available online. By just taking a minute to kind of do the research and look into what people are saying, you can ensure that any science communication, any efforts you're taking to get involved in COVID-19 do keep equity, diversity, and inclusion in mind.
I have a couple things I wanted to add listening to you two who just spoke. The first is that there's kind of an odd equity issue emerging, again, that I'm hearing about it as I talk to people who are in office. And It's that, you know, historically you hold public meetings, and whether that's at the city council level or state senate, and there's a natural filter for the public participating in a particular issue, which is that they have to physically go and get themselves to a meeting and be brave enough to get up to the microphone. And so now these are becoming Zoom meetings, and it means you get barraged with potentially hundreds of people wanting to speak. So on the one hand, wow, isn't that great, right? You want the citizen participation. And on the other hand, the filter's gone because it's so easy to click into a Zoom meeting. And there's a shifting demography, of course, because some of the elderly people are not getting on a Zoom meeting, but may have been the very people who had time as retirees to go to meetings. So I think it's something our whole societies and country have to be thinking about during COVID in terms of information exchange, is this sort of weird demographic shift with the use of Zoom. Here we are on Zoom. And then the other thing is, listening to John, I really respect the idea that getting across scientific process is what we want to be doing at the end of the day, and sort of allowing every citizen to become able to weigh evidence in decision-making, or to look to experts who are weighing evidence. And here we are in this particularly sensitive time because COVID deals with our health, you know, and our very survival. So it's a time when misinformation can very quickly spin out, you know, into society and into fear. And there was a long debate just last week on the AAAS Fellows listserv about the validity of claims about COVID hijacking hemoglobin. And it took days and days for a bunch of scientists with PhDs to resolve this. And so really, what can we expect of the public in terms of assimilating this massive body of information? And I like John's perspective that at the end of the day, if we can be really transparent, that's going to do a long-term service of showing what science process really looks like, that it's long and it's iterative and it's confusing and that it takes a lot of voices to get to something close to the truth.
So I kind of have both hats. So putting on my geneticist hat, one of the niche areas that my lab focuses on is in research in underrepresented minority populations. So again, complex trait human genetics research, which if you look in the literature of the risk factors for type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular disease, the sample sizes in Caucasian populations are 1.2 million individuals in a genome-wide study. And then I am in the process of aggregating all of the genetic data available anywhere in the world to study type 2 diabetes in Hispanics, and we come up with 45,000. So the amount of inequity there is tremendous, and what it means is that we're at risk of leaving behind populations that have already been left behind by healthcare access and, you know, socioeconomic initiatives. We're also about to leave them behind in the era of precision medicine and precision health. And so I work very closely with a group of individuals performing epidemiologic research of cardiometabolic diseases down at the US-Mexico border. So looking at Hispanics and Latinos, Mexican Americans in the impoverished communities right along the US-Mexico border. So it's a lot of at-risk immigrant populations down there. So we are initiating a big COVID response there, where we're hoping to initiate testing in communities where testing would otherwise be completely unavailable. And then downstream, it's one thing to have a positive test, but it's another thing to bring healthcare when the test comes back positive. And so we're trying to work out the kinks. And of course, my angle in is just this narrow angle of genetics, but I would encourage researchers who are finding their biomedical research at the intersection of COVID to not forget about these communities that are sometimes invisible otherwise. So that's the genetic side. And then taking off that hat and putting on my Reddit hat, one thing that's amazing about Reddit, although it is online and our demographics edge on the younger side, it is a relatively democratic space where anyone can comment and anyone can weigh in. And for the most part, everyone's voices are sort of seen as equal. Within the R-Science community, we have a couple of checks in place to prevent a loud, outraged minority from shutting down scientific debate and meaningful conversation. We have very, very strict rules that keep topics on, or keeps conversations on topic. And we also have a method for highlighting individuals who have specific expertise, where we give people, our users, flair. So for example, after my name on Reddit, it says, Professor Computational Human Genetics, which means that when I weigh in a conversation, you can see the expertise that I'm coming from. So if I'm weighing in on a conversation about physics, you probably know I have no idea what I'm talking about and have no credibility. And so I would like to see that it would be nice if there were more spaces online that were moderated in a similar way, that could enable meaningful, meaty conversations about the ongoing science in a way that was shielded and protected from trolling or sea lining or other sort of nefarious actors that are trying to influence the dialogue. Our science is one where we've, I think, done a pretty effective job of being able to communicate at large with general populations that's still very much insulated from the effects of people who are trying to change the narrative. And I would encourage people that are at the forefront of other social media research and other social media spaces to consider how they can also create areas where expertise is verified, vetted, and where conversations can happen in a way that is accurate, informed, and protected from the people with ill intent.
Thank you. And I appreciate the real range of opportunities for kind of prioritizing equity that we just covered in these four responses. So thanks for that. And another thing that you've all mentioned a little bit is that sometimes scientists or researchers are often hesitant to step outside their lane of expertise. And so at first, when you see the COVID crisis heating up, you might feel sort of like John on the airplane, like, this is not my time, this is not my expertise. And I hope we're kind of drawing a picture of different ways to engage, but I'm wondering how you would respond to a researcher who really feels that way, that because they're not an expert in the virus or the disease, that they're really not sure if they should engage in this moment.
I'll go first, I guess, again. So I kind of have two different answers. Number one, I think that all scientists should advocate for the process of science. Because once again, like, the fact that I know how your muscles work really well, that does not, like, I have a doctorate in biomedical engineering, but I make a joke with my students that I teach anatomy and physiology with. My undergraduate degree was in physics. I didn't take any biology courses when I was an undergrad, so I always joke that I don't believe in cells. So when my students were coming at me with pretty intense coronavirus questions, before we moved to online learning, I was like, all right, well, I'll show you how I find information on this. And pretty much we started doing a lot of stuff on, like, more or less like data literacy and scientific literacy. And I think that's a big thing that we can all do. And especially people, like anyone who's like taught a college class, like we know how to communicate with different stakeholders. And then number two, even though I'm just a biomechanist, there are a bunch of very interesting intersections between COVID and its effect on society and my work and my field's work. So one of the biggest things that's going to be absolutely fascinating, and now I'm putting on my scientist hat, is what the impact of long periods of inactivity are going to have on people's muscles and their bones and everything like that, and how that's going to affect activity patterns in the future. So we can look at this from a sports perspective. So these NFL players haven't been able to run around and hit each other and lift all the weights they want to do for the past month, and who knows when it's going to start up again. Do we expect to see higher rates of injury in the next season? There's a bunch of different ways to study that. Number two, one of the things that's really fascinating, I'm really into large crowdsourced data collection. So the idea of being able to do a study where we can look at people's activity levels while they're in quarantine and then looking at how they rebound after that, that will give us a really, really interesting data set. And then finally, from like a legitimate public health perspective, when you have somebody who's been very inactive because they've been laid up with COVID-19 for a month, how is that going to impact their fall risk? What types of changes are we going to see in their muscle architecture and how they're able to move? And then what can we do to help physical therapists create the best regime to help them rehabilitate? So a lot of my work has been focused on, like, after surgery, if you have an Achilles tendon rupture, how do people get better? And the thing is that these prolonged periods of bed rest for like a large portion of our population, it's going to be very, very interesting and important for biomechanists to step up to the plate and start answering these questions with our expertise. Mm-hmm. So even though I barely know what RNA replication is, there's still a way that we can help with this crisis.
So what I usually say when someone is kind of hesitating to engage, whether it's COVID-19 or something else, is when you as a scientist don't speak up, you're leaving behind an information vacuum, and someone else, either with good or bad intentions, can come in and fill that space. So if you don't step up, someone else will. And kind of the second thing that I usually say is that as scientists, we're literally funded by taxpayer dollars to conduct research and build all of these key science literacy skills. And it's now more than ever that the public really needs us. So whether you're reviewing preprints, you're volunteering for a COVID-19 related initiative, or you're debunking misinformation, it's each contribution, small or big, that's really going to help us right now.
So I can channel Artie Garg a little bit. And because one of her platforms for ESAL is that communities thrive when everybody participates and tackles challenges together. And so, it's not just that we're scientists, just as humans in our communities is a call to participating. And especially given what Farah just said, if you don't participate, somebody else is in that spot. And we talked already a little bit about sort of the general skills scientists can bring in terms of sifting through evidence for what's reliable and not. But I know Artie would also say that as scientists, we need to recognize our limitations and what discipline we're in, which is very much what John was just saying. You know what discipline you're in, and scientists are generally good at knowing what they know and what they don't know. And so this is a time with COVID to recognize our limitations, and step carefully as we get involved civically, but to not let that be a barrier. And again, that senator that I met with this morning, I'm just going to quickly read you a quote from him, which I thought was really awesome. Again, he's a number of years now into civic engagement, and he said, "Everybody is just a regular person at the end of the day." As Secretary Powell said, there are no superheroes. Just bringing your skill set to the problems and working hard is what separates people.
Yeah, that's inspiring. And to echo a little bit of what Farah said, the opportunity to step into that void and stay in your lane exists if the tactic that you take is to amplify the voices of experts. If you use the audiences that you have and you use the outreach that is at your fingertips to point people in the direction of the people that they should be listening to, then you kind of can intersect both without necessarily trying to stick yourself into an area of science where you really have no leg to stand on. And I love the jokes that have been going around about, the internet flying around with, every physicist is now an epidemiologist and every molecular biologist is now everybody's got their model, right? That they want to put out there on Twitter or, even on one of the bioarchives. I think that there's both a need to kind of rein in and for scientists to recognize when they're out of their space, and to be respectful of that. But also I think that there's a lot of need for us to sort of look around and identify the experts who should be the voices that we want the general public to be listening to in all of this, and point the audiences that we each have as individuals in those directions.
And one thing to build off of that, we need to explain to people what preprints are. Number one. Okay. I'm a big fan of preprints, but the thing is that like it's not peer reviewed. What does that mean? And explaining it.
Great point.
Artie, I'll jump in just for a sec too, that Artie said she is really inspired to see how quickly the STEM community has just activated to meet this challenge with people just coming in, and that it really, it does give a more expansive view of what it means to be a scientist, to be dealing with this crisis.
Right, and I think there are a couple of sort of cautionary notes embedded in some of the things you've all shared, you know, like to make sure whoever you are amplifying is an expert on the topic. And John, you were alluding to after sort of that science is working when we actually discover that previous recommendations weren't exactly right. And so maybe not, you know, sort of being super steadfast towards the current recommendations that I appreciate. And one thing I was thinking about is we talked a bit about community is, of course, science itself is a community, and we have many sub-communities within science. And I'm curious if you have thoughts on how researchers might engage more with their into their academic communities or their professional communities in this time. So thinking about that, you know, a lot of researchers, of course, have been affected by the pandemic, but some are affected more than others, of course. And are there, do you have ideas about how we can support and advocate for those in our professional communities who might especially sort of need it during this time?
So as I mentioned a few times, I am a graduate student, and I think we are going to be impacted a lot by COVID-19. So for a lot of the graduate students around me, a lot of us are wondering, all right, so what do? We can't do experiments at home. For computational folks, they're lucky that most of them can continue on if they have access to resources. But what about people who can't live on campus anymore? What about people who are wondering how to get home? What happens to our funding? Do we still defend our theses online? Like, there are a lot of questions. For me, as I mentioned earlier, the answer for me was kind of to build a survey to assess the different experiences that Canadian graduate students are having. And by collecting all this data, we can launch any advocacy efforts to help support grad students across Canada. So if there are any trainees listening in or any academics who are worried about graduate students, my recommendation here would be to reach out to your graduate student unions, to reach out to your department chair, ask them what efforts are in place to support graduate students, and is anyone kind of surveying how they can help graduate students and what their current priorities are. Without having that information or that data in hand, we're not going to be sure where to kind of target relief efforts to. So yeah, that's my little spiel to think about the grad students right now.
So that is an excellent point. I would also add my own plea. Please think about the postdocs. So as someone who is on the job market this year and then was going to be on it next year, it's a barren desert and it's terrifying. I know I talked to a lot of junior faculty who are stressed about tenure clocks and everything like that. And it's a stressful time for everyone. I'm incredibly fortunate in the fact that I have another year of funding for my postdoc. So I'm incredibly grateful that I have that to fall back on. I think just sitting there and making sure that everybody is empathetic and understanding of different circumstances is really important.
Yeah, I can't tell you how incredibly lucky I feel that I got tenure last fall, and am somewhat insulated from some of the job insecurity. So my personal plea for people to remember how complicated people's lives can be in this environment of COVID is that I'm on maternity leave actually right now, and have a 2-year-old and a 12-week-old. And while many of my colleagues are using this time to churn out the backlog of papers that they have had sitting on their hard drives with all of the data generated and just haven't had the bandwidth to write, or churning out, dozens of grants at this time while they've got, the quiet, peaceful environment of their homes, There are a lot of researchers right now who don't have the benefit of that and whose homes are especially chaotic right now. That said, I realize that I'm deeply, deeply privileged to be where I am career-wise in this moment, and to have two young ones and career stability, whereas many women and men in science have young ones and are still postdocs or are early career investigators or are graduate students. But it's an important thing to remember that there's going to be a lot of sort of shifting productivity as we look back on the last year among scientists.
Yeah, I'm concerned about the looking forward, about what's going to happen to universities and research programs. And honestly, especially all the research programs that don't have anything to do with COVID, and therefore might get kind of backburnered and not have the funding. I mean, I saw that yesterday, I think Boston University has already shut down for the fall. And as that starts happening, of course, the funding stream to the universities is going to get cut off. So, and the Natural History Museum is closed, the Smithsonian's closed. And I just wonder in the long term about all those other valuable ongoing basic research and applied research. I have noticed that a lot of societies and organizations are offering up lots of free resources that usually people pay for, trainings and collaborations. So that's one way to try to keep things moving in this odd time.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is there is not just one bucket of scientists and researchers who we want to be especially thinking of in this time. And I really appreciate the comment, especially about changing our expectations about productivity and recognizing that many of us are being affected in different ways. And I mean, to that end, I know there's kind of a narrative we all live with a lot about the expectation that we are productive all the time. And for many researchers, responding to COVID really could and should just be taking care of themselves and those who are around them. And, I think it's important to emphasize that although we're all sharing opportunities, I know we've all discussed that that sort of response is incredibly important as well. So we've got a couple minutes left, and I want to take a question to, actually, we've got sort of two questions here. Oh, wow. All right. All the questions are pouring in. These are excellent. First, let's try to quickly touch on this one. In short, Michelle asks, who has time? It takes twice as long to do everything on the computer and remote, and is struggling to finish spring classes and working twice as much. How do you find time? Which I think is a really understandable question here.
So as someone who's trying to graduate and defend her thesis, I feel you. For me, some days I'm great, some days I get a lot of things done and I'm very happy with myself. Some days I get nothing done and I'm literally just watching Netflix because that's how I'm handling the day, and that's fine. It's kind of our new normal. There should be no expectations for productivity. People have very different situations. The one thing that I do try to do is kind of write down 2 things that I know I need to get done in a day. That way, at least when if I finish those, no matter how small or big they are, I'm happy. So you kind of have to find the balance that works for you and what you're okay with completing or not completing for the day.
And I'd say for those of us that are in positions of privilege, which, as I said before, I really count myself as one of those, my research is able to continue. I'm secure in my job. I have a lot of outlets where I'm able to pivot into the COVID space. I think that for those of us who are in sort of more stable positions, to remember to reach out. I saw another one of the questions was actually about, do you have recommendations for transitioning experimental research to computational research? And so to sort of merge the 2 questions together, I think, for somebody like me to open myself up to collaborations with somebody who's trying to make that pivot, that might not, so, for me to be aware that I might have a role in helping somebody else transition their research that is not COVID related, but that is still part of the pandemic response and part of my obligation to my own scientific community, I think is really key. And I'm teaching a class this spring, and I don't know if it's, even it sort of feels like a distant memory right now, but we actually were hit by a terrible tornado in Nashville, which destroyed a tremendous number of buildings near campus. And so many of my students were actually severely affected by that as well. So it sort of feels like the season of disaster here at Vanderbilt. And one of the things that I decided to do in my capacity as a professor, I said, we're going to go back in time to before the first tragedy. Since every tragedy is affecting everyone in my class differently, I'm going to look at everyone's grades before that first tragedy. And lo, we had like 1 or 2 homework assignments and everyone got A's on them. And I said, I'm going to give everyone the grade that they had before that first tragedy. The rest of the semester, it's up to you. You can either do the work if you have the bandwidth to do the work, and I will be here to support you in doing that work. Or if you don't have the bandwidth and you need to care for those around you or care for yourself, whatever's going on for you, that should be your priority right now. And just know that your stupid grade for your stupid graduate school class is the least thing on your hierarchy of worries right now. And that was something that I was able to do to support those students. And so I would encourage each of you in your own lives, whatever it is that is within your sphere, that you have the power and the agency to be able to do to help those around you. Pay attention and keep yourself open to those opportunities as they come.
Yeah, a lot of the response that I've done has been, Farah was talking earlier about just scrolling through Twitter. I found a really good way to describe that somewhere online. I forget what it is, but doom scrolling. I found myself constantly doom scrolling early March, and this project has kind of given me an outlet for that. So there's a lot of days where I know I have to work on this paper, and I know I need to process this data. I know I need to do this and I need to do that, and honestly, I just can't. I'm also teaching a class at Lincoln University right now as part of my postdoctoral fellowship. So meeting the needs of my students has been very intense because they're in downtown Philadelphia or Baltimore or New York City, and some of them have parents who are getting sick, aunts and uncles, and it's just very, very difficult to make it so that this is a class, this isn't something that is going to be really foundational for the seniors that I have. So sitting there and finding a balance between those two things is very important. One of the things that Paul just asked was how can we pivot into online teaching? And I was reminded by this because Dr. Bellows' dog just walked by. So one of the things that I did in my online class accidentally that was actually very effective is we actually did a show and tell with our pets in a college class. And that got everyone to turn on their cameras and talk about something that they were excited about. And it really, I didn't think that we're going to need to break the ice after 2 months in the classroom, but this is a very different environment than what the students are used to for learning. So just sitting there and making sure that the students know that you're invested in them and give them an opportunity to talk about something that they love, like their dog or cat or little brother, is something that I found to be pretty effective.
Yeah, I think I found that there are a number of opportunities in this time that didn't exist before. If they existed, I wasn't seeing them. And again, echoing Piper, though, it's because, assuming that you don't have COVID and you're not in the hospital and your relatives aren't and you can access food, right, and a number of other things. So in the best of circumstances, though, I found that it's a time to reconnect with a lot of people that you weren't connecting with because we're always, run, go. And so I don't know about you all, but for me, it means I'm checking in on people that I hadn't maybe checked in on a long time. And, there are these new modes of interacting that might mean, again, if you're lucky and you can go outside because you're in a lower density area, that you're connecting with people in new ways on long walks through the neighborhood. And then I saw a comment in here about, reduce shipping impacts on the ocean. And as an ecologist and animal behavior person, I'm watching this news come out about certain species of animals repopulating areas that are, highly human. And so, again, not to downplay the significance of what humanity is suffering right now, there is something very interesting in seeing what happens with you know, the carbon emissions down? How far are they really going to go down with people not flying so much and driving cars? And how much space is this going to make for other wildlife? And what does that look like? And what does that maybe remind us of in terms of our values as a society that we could hold on to even post-pandemic?
Yeah. And one other thing I just thought of is I think that based on that question, I think this is a really exciting time for citizen science. One of my favorite papers combining citizen science and rehabilitation science and biomechanics is that they pretty much took some people who were recovering from shoulder injuries, and what they did is they recruited them as subjects in like a water sampling project, where they developed a situation where you could like more or less rehab and control a small motorized boat as it was like doing water sampling around like a park or something. And the compliance rates for that rehab was much higher than if they just like gave them a sheet of paper and asked them to do it on their own, because they felt like they were doing something productive and important and noteworthy. So I think that in terms of what type of things could we do for a model in our world right now, and then also in the post-virus world, giving people productive things to do that are helpful for society and also our scientific inquiry is potentially powerful and can help people in a lot of ways.
Yeah, thank you. And given that we are 2 minutes over already, I think that's a wonderful note to end on, is that there will be a world post-virus. And I really appreciate all of you today for sharing some thoughts about how we can respond in this moment and get us to that world as soon as effectively as possible. So thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.